Hey everyone, welcome to the Powerful Entrepreneur Podcast. My name's Arthur Shulsky. Today I'm really excited to have Nolan Zandy as a special guest on this episode and over the course of this 7-part series where we talk about Charlemagne. Nolan is a colleague and a close friend, and he's a student of world history, as we all are and should be. Say hello, Nolan.
Hello everyone, pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the podcast.
Yeah, it's going to be an awesome 7 parts. And again, we're going to be talking about Charlemagne. So I think one of the most underrated characters in all of world history, Charlemagne. I don't think any of my grade school, elementary, junior high, or high school history classes even touched on who Charlemagne was.
No, I think it's pretty much the same for me as well. This is, I wouldn't say a new experience, but in terms of background, but definitely new in terms of the depth by far. I don't think I've ever had an opportunity even to learn as much about this character, and it's been really exciting.
We've been doing a lot of research, Nolan and I, in preparation for the 7-part series, and we kind of want to have a diverse 7 parts. Obviously, Charlemagne coming from, post-collapse of the Roman Empire, pre-Middle Ages, probably around the Dark Ages almost. Charlemagne really doesn't have a ton of accounts, a ton of written documentation over what he did, but there's still a lot. And it was quite a pleasure getting to read some of the first accounts, second accounts of Charlemagne and the history around him.
Absolutely.
So, this first episode is kind of the intro episode. I hate to call it an intro episode because it really does get into a lot of meat around Charlemagne, but we have to kind of set the world and where it was right before Charlemagne's emergence. That is so important to the story of Charlemagne and really covers a broad part of world history. One of the most crucial components of what makes the world today really goes into Charlemagne's background. And kind of what does that background look like? What exactly created the opportunity for Charlemagne to become a legend in history? And really it starts with a couple hundred years before Charlemagne was even born, before the Franks even existed. The Roman Empire was a tetrarchy, and it was split into multiple parts, and there was a big civil war, and Constantine the Great achieved victory over his rivals. And when he won that civil war, he split the empire into 2 parts. He made Christianity the global religion within the Roman Empire, so they got rid of paganism. And that monotheistic dominance of the Roman culture at that moment really was split into 2 parts. And those parts went right along the lines of how the empire was created by Constantine in that moment. The Eastern Byzantine Empire being what I like to call Old Rome, the old Roman traditions of having a Caesar. And the Western Empire really descended into poverty. And that event, that splitting of the empire by Constantine, was probably the first of why Charlemagne became legendary.
Absolutely. One of the things about it that I found pretty interesting is when Constantine split the empire, it still existed in the Western half. The Western half was sick, but it was definitely kind of an acceptance that political continuity on the Western side was going to have some problems, while on the Eastern side it was a lot more concrete. And you can see 200 years later, even a little bit, obviously more than that, when you get to the end of the Roman Empire and then on to Charlemagne's time, the idea of Rome was more of a tradition. It's hard to understand fully how they saw the difference between the traditions of Western Rome, all the titles they still had, patrician and princeps and things like that, and the Roman names they still had, and the romancing languages that they were adopting. It's interesting and I'd love to learn more of that versus the political state that was still the Eastern Roman Empire, which was at that point a dictatorship. It had a political entity. It even still had part of Italy at that point. I think it had the southern part. It didn't have Rome, but it had the southern part. And so that kind of set the stage for the world that Charlemagne was born into. Definitely. Their understanding of what Rome was by that point definitely still existed. But it's curious to understand more, and I look to understand more about how they were able to separate the former Western Rome with the former Eastern Rome, define the actions that they took, especially as he took what eventually became the Western Roman crown, at least an honorary one, later in his career that we'll get to.
Yeah, we'll get to that. There's a lot. There's a lot to cover before that one. Really kind of reiterating what Nolan was kind of going on when they split the empire, there was still a lot of that Rome left in Rome. I know it kind of seems like a stupid thing to say, but the Byzantine Empire really did take with it all the power of Rome. And all that was left in the actual city of Rome was the history there. And a lot of the, kind of cultural things that kind of define the Roman city as that part of the world. But remember, it was now Catholic. So that is a huge difference from the old Rome. And those Christian Catholic kind of administrations that came up, after Constantine switched the empire over, created a completely different landscape in the West. And it really just kind of crumbled into poverty. And I say, death blow to the Western Roman Empire was the invasions of the Gothic hordes. And when those barbarians came steaming in from, Eastern Europe, the German areas, the Germanic barbarian tribes that were kind of flooding into where the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths all ended up, they sacked Rome, they burned it to the ground, and they destroyed a huge portion of all the history and all the legacy that Rome kind of had up until that point. And that was a very material moment in the history of the world that kind of defined the opportunity that Charlemagne embraced.
It's true. I think the only thing that I would add there that I found interesting and something pointing out, especially as we kind of bring this full circle to the later business implications of this, is that the Gothic sacking of Rome and the barbarian sackings of Rome during the last century of its existence really kind of reset the political and economic landscape of Western Europe. It was basically a blank market. I mean, there were no firms or economic links that went any distance. Politically, they descended back into many cases, not always, but in many cases, almost tribal units, limited lengths of their communication and their rivalries. And you'll see this during Charlemagne's reign. It was a very, very disunified place economically and politically. And so it created a very unique opportunity for the people that came kind of after the dust had mostly settled from this and then Islam and all of the waves of conflict that were going, that it kind of created a perfect new market for the birth of Charlemagne as he came into being in the mid 8th century.
I like that word, new market. That was smart. We'll come back to that. And I guess the third key, and obviously I could go on and on of reasons why Charlemagne had an opportunity. But this third one is just so material to the whole conversation that I kind of want to do another 7-part series just on this one piece of the puzzle, and that is the birth of Islam. And when Islam came about, this was after Constantine converted the Roman Empire over to Christianity. Upon the start of the Byzantine Empire, Rome still ruled Egypt. They still ruled most of, the Eastern Mediterranean. And when Islam came about, they just dominated all of North Africa, up through Spain, a little bit of southern Italy. They took Egypt, Alexandria, and one of the most dramatic, pivotal points in Roman history was the taking of Alexandria, and started putting a lot of threat on the Byzantine Empire. And just that crucial kind of component of how it split the world into two parts along the Mediterranean. You had the southern part, which was predominantly Islamic, And you have the northern part, which was this impoverished, barbarian-ruled, no central state, Western Europe, and then the Eastern Europe, which had a strong central state, a lot of wealth, but I wouldn't say they were on the downfall, but they were not as strong as they once were. The Eastern Empire was not anywhere near what they once were. They had lost a lot of land, and I would say they kind of fell into their habits at that time. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little more, Nolan, but there's a lot we can talk about here.
There's so much to touch briefly. Islam at the time, it was both on the upswing, but also at a fortuitous time for Charlemagne in particular. Muhammad's initial conquests were in the mid 500s. The Umayyad Caliphate, which was the rising empire at the time, was hitting its peak in the early 700s during the time of Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel. And the Battle of Tours that stopped the invasion of Islam into Europe and checked their advance, it also coincided with the downfall of the Umayyads as well. They ended almost as quickly as they grew, collapsing in fights over succession power between different sects of Islam, and divisions. The Sunni Shia division and other divisions started forming during that time that was perfect for Charlemagne, being born 20 years later or so, to have a Europe that, again, was a stiller market, was less chaotic, was chaotic, but chaotic to his advantage. There weren't greater powers putting pressure. They were dealing with their own problems. And the same with in Eastern Rome as well, the Eastern Roman Empire. They were probably at their peak in the 1700s, but literally at the peak, and the downfall was in progress. The start of the downfall that happened many centuries was in progress. They weren't growing by the time that Charlemagne was given relevance, and I think that was very important to the opportunity provided to Charlemagne during his lifetime. It was both his initiative, it was also an opportunity he identified. Anybody in Europe could have taken advantage of that opportunity. But it's important to, I think, point out the opportunity available to rulers of Charlemagne's class during that exact time in history.
Beautifully said. And that really kind of is a nice bridge into what our next part is okay, now we have labeled this opportunity. And so there's an opportunity exists. And I think that's an important thing to note for when we do start discussing the entrepreneurial component, is how Charlemagne has been inserted into a pivotal moment in history where an opportunity exists to exert some sort of new idea, dominance, or control over an area. Now that we've labeled that, how did Charlemagne come to become the Holy Roman Emperor? And that is a long story, and obviously it's going to take up most of the 7 parts. But we're going to get into kind of the brief intro, the brief early part of, kind of what made Charlemagne right now. And when Rome was destroyed, it left, like kind of Nolan said earlier, in other words, a power vacuum in the Western Europe. And there was really no one controlling. There was Islam in Spain, in southern Italy. There was Goths and barbarians literally scattered all throughout Western Europe. And there was just no central state. The Byzantine Empire, while still strong and powerful, had very limited power and almost no influence on the western half of Europe. I mean, literally, they were almost just ignored.
It's funny that the traditions of old Western Rome were more respected and more followed. Eastern Rome was always looked at more as like a rival, almost like Islam, where it was more like a rival to their power as opposed to something they wanted to be a part of. And it was a very interesting, different dynamic.
Yeah, I always thought it was more like, the Western Europe, because it was impoverished at this time, probably looked to the Eastern Empire as almost jealousy. I would say it's almost like a jealous place. Constantine moving the capital over there. And there was a lot of wealth. It was very affluent in the East, especially with trading with like the early Viking states and stuff like that. Some of the great roads that were built along the like Balkans and things like that. So, there was definitely this rivalry there. And pretty much Western Europe was just not only impoverished, but surrounded by enemies. They had a lot of inner fighting. And the church in Rome was completely powerless. They were really the only central state in Western Europe at the time that had any sort of input on what the rest of the Western Europe was doing, but at the same time, that was extremely fickle because whether or not some minor king in the old Gallic, states would pledge homage or allegiance to the papacy was insignificant because there was 5 other people that were probably just going to ignore it and go to war with them anyways. So the church didn't have a lot of power at that time, but they did exist, and that is an important component within our story.
Absolutely. I was actually about to make that exact same point. The church had some power that to get anything done required the cooperation of too many for it to be practical for one person to be able to influence enough. It was always, they could get 3 out of the 5 to do something or 4 out of the 6, but it was never clean. It was always very, very messy, and they definitely couldn't unilaterally do pretty much anything until, of course, things got a little bit more centralized in Europe later.
Which is exactly what's going to lead us next section, which is really going over the whys of how Charlemagne became powerful, how he became the Holy Roman Emperor. We're going to kind of split this up into 3 parts. I mean, there's probably like 100 parts, but we're going to really talk about the 3 main early decisions that Charlemagne made that allowed him to become a ruler of that territory. And the first part is that when Charlemagne's father passed away, the Frankish kingdom was probably one of the largest kingdoms within Western Europe at the time. So Charlemagne wasn't really starting off on the ground level. He was starting off in a very powerful position. He had a fight with his brother for that power, that position of power. And when his father died, he split the empire into 2 parts, the eastern part and the western part of the Frankish kingdom. And Charlemagne got the western part. His brother got the eastern part. And what happened was Charlemagne started, how should I say this, subterfuge? Is that a good word for it, Nolan? Or allying himself with these other parties around, specifically the Lombards and the Bavarians, around his brother's kingdom that kind of put his brother in a risky position. So it wasn't a direct threat. That's why it's more almost like espionage when it's not a direct military threat, but it's like, oh my gosh, I am completely surrounded by my brother's allies, and I have no allies of my own.
Yeah, there was some drama earlier on. One thing that's interesting, and it makes me think that his love of warfare or his need for warfare was part of it, was that apparently Charlemagne and his brother inherited their territory, which actually wasn't that common at the time. There were a lot of elections going on. These bands were small enough that there was still a sense of community between the overall group. People knew each other, so they were a little bit more comfortable deciding things that way. But the other thing that's also interesting is with his brother, apparently right after his father died and they inherited their territory, there were some rebellions in Charlemagne's territory. The Aquitaine and one other region engaged in a rebellion, feeling that they no longer needed a father died who they felt they had true allegiance to. His brother didn't help out very much. Apparently kind of blew him off, stayed in his own area, and that kind of caused I think that caused a decision that he couldn't really rely on his brother to help him out. And I think it's also important to point that out because later in his life, he relies a lot on his family to fight with him. His sons fight alongside him a lot, engage in a lot of campaigning. He wouldn't be able to manage such a sprawling empire without his family involved. So you would think that his brother would have been involved, and I think that he may have had an opportunity to be involved in all of this, but he was too petty at the beginning, and it kind of started this beef where he didn't kill his brother, he didn't go to war with his brother, but he was not interested in working with his brother, and he kind of isolated him in this manner.
And it's funny you said that, where you said that he didn't kill his brother because, from a historical science perspective, we don't necessarily know how his brother died.
True.
From what I was reading, and this is what took me as just absolutely fascinating. And this is kind of why I hinted at a little more espionage than like a military direct conquest. is that, Charlemagne was very obviously, he married the princess of the Lombard kingdom. He allied himself with the Bavarian states. I mean, it was a very obvious place to undermine his brother's hand of control of the area. And all of a sudden, in the perfect time, like the exact perfect moment, right before, I think it was right before Charlemagne was about to, I don't want to say divorce. It was kind of it's like kind of before the word divorce even happened, but returned the Lombard princess back to her father and refused to abide by his side of the deal. And so, like, right before Charlemagne was about to do that, his brother dies. And unites
all of... That is very suspicious. That's true. That's true.
And he unites all of the Franks under one banner. It just in the right time when he's like, you know what? I think going to war with the Lombards makes sense.
It's true. It's true. One way or another, Charlemagne was someone who never passed up an opportunity. Never. So whether it was natural causes or not, he definitely took advantage of that situation. And he definitely did not have good relations with his brother. So absolutely.
And this kind of turns into, like, really the next two parts is like what happened next. I mean, so Charlemagne's brother dies. He, whether it be luck or choice, ambition, the empire is now his. The kingdom is now under one banner. And he decides to go to war with the Lombard kingdoms, which was pretty much all of northern Italy and kind of wrapped around into central Italy, right above the Papal States. Now, there was a key element to the relationships in Italy at the time that Charlemagne labeled and took advantage of. The Catholic Church being, obviously the only central figurehead or, administrative body within Western Europe at the time. So he saw that opportunity, but he also knew that the papacy did not get along with the Lombard king. In fact, they hated each other. And when his brother died, and the flag was united, and the Lombard king was like ready to go to war, and Charlemagne agreed, and they kind of entered into this long campaign against one another. It was the perfect time for Charlemagne to literally send emissaries down to the Papal States and pledge allegiance to the Pope. And that single move was absolutely crucial in Charlemagne's unifying power within Western Europe, because it aligned his actions with the only unifying administrative party in all of Western Europe.
It was a bit of luck. Some people say in the long run, some things backfired, but there was a bit of luck on both sides. I think for Charlemagne, it was a no-brainer of a deal to get involved. He had some claim to some land in Italy, and he wasn't going to get it unless he was able to get on the good side of the Pope. The Pope had area. They had limited power, but they had most power in that area. So he had the opportunity to join with a force that still had a lot. Like we said earlier, they didn't have all of the influence. They weren't able to do anything unilaterally, but they could get maybe a majority of powers to get along with their decisions. They were frequently used for judgments, for arbitration, land disputes. They had real influence, even if it wasn't direct power. So it was a massive opportunity for Charlemagne, and it was a massive opportunity for the Pope as well. Finally, the Pope would have an opportunity to have a military force behind him. He'd been hamstrung many times in their plans and ideas for the church by their lack of military force, and they would have to make an expedient political alliance, but they had to do that anyway, just to stay alive in Europe at that time. And they were making alliances with people like the Lombards and other things. They finally had someone. The Pope placed a bet on essentially the military skill of Charlemagne. Can he keep winning, so that this alliance and this military force extension will actually bear fruit, and we won't get stuck like allying with anyone else, where they were never able to maintain the victory streak that he wanted. So it was a really interesting deal, business deal, political deal, that I think made sense for both sides, allowed them both to take advantage of the other. And the only thing that needed to happen for it to work out and be the legendary deal that it was that Charlemagne had to keep winning his battles, and he did. So it really worked out.
He did, and we'll get into that third main reason why Charlemagne's original kind of pursuit or steps towards power happened, and that really was defining when he decided to invade northern Italy. And when the Pope gave Charlemagne the claims to all the land in northern Italy, or all of the Lombard kingdom, land, that moment was when Charlemagne was like, all right, well, then I'm going to go and stake my claim. And that he did. He marched a decently large army into North Italy. There was a pass through the Alps when he was on his march through to to the Lombard kingdoms, where the opposing army, the Lombard army, was stationed, and Charlemagne, with some brilliant tactics, avoided military conflict with that army and was able to besiege the capital of the Lombard kingdoms and pinned the king of Lombardia in that castle for, I think it was almost a year.
I think so, yeah.
I think it was a year. And one of the funny things that happened was the king of the Lombards sent his son to gather his allies, raise the bannermen to fend off Charlemagne's army. His son was just ignored. People did not honor their loyalties to the Lombard king, and instead just peacefully did not intervene.
This particular incident, Charlemagne, as we know, engaged in military campaigns his entire career and conquered most of Western Europe. I mean, victory after victory before and definitely after this. But this definitely got him, this was a very visible victory. This got him a lot of personal favor from the Pope. It earned him his land. It also showed me, tying into some of the brilliance of Charlemagne from a organizational standpoint, there were, not related directly to the Lombards, there were 2 rebellions during the siege. I mean, he was pinned down for a year, running an empire that was not totally stable. I mean, it was still all these people speaking different languages, not unified. There were 2 major wars that he had to fight in the middle of this siege that he left, took care of, and came back, still coming back to complete the siege. His ability to manage multiple wars, you had in this era, if you had to be, there's a reason why there weren't very many Charlemagnes in this area. To be able to build an empire, to be able to build a state larger than a few hundred miles, 4 wars at a time, and his ability to organize and do this was really shown during this campaign. It's one of the top things that I'm studying and trying to learn more about. How exactly was he able to be so on top of it? And he was on top of it, and his success really led to everything that happened after for him, and for the church as well, for a good couple hundred years.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That organizational ability, the ability to execute when called upon to, and not back down in the face of a challenge. Charlemagne took everything on head on himself, and obviously he was a master delegator also. He had multiple generals, multiple subordinates who obviously were overseeing the siege when he was off fighting those other battles. So this was a guy that knew how to delegate, knew how to pick people to be in power when he needed them. And I remember, I think it was right after, or it might have even been during the siege, he went down to the Papal States and he visited the Pope, and the Pope confirmed the alliance. And from then on, he conquered Lombardia, and he ruled all of the Lombard states, and he ruled all of the Frankish states. He was the powerhouse in Western Europe, allied with the Pope. Over the next 6 parts of this show, we're going to go into how did he continue to build and expand and create one of the largest Western empires, pretty much up until Napoleon. I think Napoleon, which was almost over 1,000 years after Charlemagne, was the only person able to do what Charlemagne did.
And in a totally different Europe at that time. It was still fragmented, but the conditions, and we'll talk about this in later parts, the conditions that he was fighting in terms of the political situation. I mean, you couldn't get a valley to be unified and speak the same language at that time. The ideas of nationalism and like unifying propaganda and things like that were in its absolute infancy, and he used it to the best of his ability and to a great extent for the time. But it's incredibly impressive considering the weapons. I mean, they're communicating by carrier pigeon, by guys on horseback, no telegraph, and they're making decisions that are affecting events 1,000 miles away. From the southern portions of Italy all the way to into northern Germany, into France. It was a really, really impressive, and from nothing too. He inherited a tiny state. It was just a really impressive development of his empire. I mean, the whole thing from start to bottom, it was a measure in competence, focus, intensity, and incredibly hard work.
I love that intensity. That's at the heart of all of these episodes, is just how intense that time was.
Mm-hmm.
Now that everyone's brains are fried with all this data, all this information, we have 6 more episodes. Charlemagne is a very fascinating, very interesting character. We're going to try to hit as much as we possibly can with him over these next 6 episodes. But really, what we really want to do right now is discuss, what does this have to do with modern entrepreneurship? Nolan and I are both entrepreneurs. We live, breathe, and eat entrepreneurship all the time. And I think, we have some very distinct and very strong takeaways here in regards to these early stories of how Charlemagne got started, that you can directly take into your day-to-day lives within an entrepreneurship venture, or whether or not you're managing a team at a company, you're starting a company, or you're running a company. There's a lot of takeaways here that the modern day entrepreneur, modern day business person can take away from Charlemagne. And really where that starts is let's turn back to the early part of our conversation, which was the opportunity. And one of the strongest things Charlemagne did was he was able to label when an opportunity existed. And when that opportunity presented itself, he didn't just sit by, he attacked. He went at it. And he didn't just attack directly, he attacked indirectly. He built a position for himself to not only take advantage of an opportunity, but to take advantage of an opportunity in the most optimum way possible. And you see that apparent in the dealings with his brother. You see that apparent in his dealings with the Lombards. You see that in dealings with the Pope and the Papal States. So that really, when you look at that ability to label and take action upon an opportunity, that is so relevant to today in any course of business or entrepreneurship.
The guy didn't lose, but just as importantly, he won the big ones almost always. And he knew exactly where to focus his resources at almost all times. The period that he lived in was definitely a unique opportunity for exactly who he was. Somebody with, a military, with some power. The invasions had stopped briefly. The Pope needed allies. Europe was very fragmented. He saw it because it was not an easy opportunity. It was a pretty narrow opportunity, even though it was there. And again, a lot of people from his era could have taken it, and somehow it was only him. And there was a reason for that. I mean, his ability to see a narrow slot in the door and dive through it and then win that opportunity is one of the most impressive things I've seen in a historical figure. They're just you can't emphasize enough that this was one of the hardest times to build an empire like he built, and to build a state, not quite a state, but to build the foundations for a political philosophy that was applied in Europe for another almost 1,000 years, until at least the Renaissance, was incredibly impressive and unprecedented. I don't think a single Roman leader ever did what he did during his lifetime.
No, I mean, I don't think a single Roman leader had the uphill battle that Charlemagne had. Maybe Constantine, but Constantine had the infrastructure around him. Constantine was fighting against 3 other rivals and won, which was a heck of an uphill battle. But Constantine also was surrounded by he was playing by the same rules as everyone else. Charlemagne was
Exactly.
not.
Exactly. There was no cohesion at that time at all. There was nothing. There was nothing to build a state like that on. You couldn't get anybody. There was no language. There was no philosophy. There was no unifying principles. There was no idea. There was still the tradition of Rome, which is how he used that title to great effect. The idea that there's a Rome out there, or that somebody with the title of a Roman Empire or king has some kind of authority. But the amount of rebellions he was dealing with constantly, the wars he was constantly fighting and winning every single one of them, that just doesn't happen. He had these structural advantages mentally in the way he organized things that allowed him to win at a percentage that normally wouldn't be possible, and allowed him to do what was almost impossible, which is to create a state that's larger than even any country in Europe today during a time when there were hundreds and hundreds of different distinct political groups that were being united.
And I think that's a really good kind of bridge into the next part, which is, there's no unifying force within Western Europe. There's all these small little groups that probably have all their own little practices, and they descended from these Gothic traditions, right, of paganism, and they want to have nothing to do with the Catholic Church whatsoever. Here comes Charlemagne and his alliance with the Pope, right? Here comes a king who has a very strong position with just taking Lombard, just, owns the Franks. He allies himself with the Pope, who is, I don't want to call a relic of the Roman age, because the Pope was not a relic of the Roman age. I mean, Rome's were pretty much pagan up until Constantine. But there was that administrative power that was the Catholic Church, collecting taxes. You talked on it earlier, Nolan. Education, the legal system, all of that was in Rome. That was the Catholic Church. It was more of a bureaucratic centrifuge of knowledge that didn't exist anywhere else in Western Europe. That was what was attractive to Charlemagne. And the fact that monotheism was also a part of that component was to a great benefit, because people in that time really cling towards their faiths, right? Like that, their faith and their religious stance was attributable to everybody in a very material way. And so there was not just that bureaucratic alliance with the administrative power of the Catholic Church, but it was also that monotheistic unifying power that all people in that time found attractive. And so by aligning himself with the Catholic Church, allowed him to create a unifying theme, a unifying philosophy for his entire empire. And again, like you said earlier, Nolan, there was a lot of rebellions. So there was a lot of people that he had to stamp into submission to fit that central Catholic Church mold. And he did this his entire life. This was, if not the single greatest achievement or accomplishment that he had obtained. And a lot of historians question whether or not it was a positive thing or a negative thing. And honestly, that's up for debate, and definitely a debate I think Nolan and I are going to be talking on with these next 6 episodes. But here today, in this episode, the one thing we can clearly take away is that by having a central uniting force, whether it be in your business, whether it be a product that you can just, is the best product to market. So your whole company, your whole team is just dead set on believing that that product is the best. Or it's a mission statement, typical like, how Google got started and they had their mission statement. All the people that spent time using Google's products or working for Google believed wholeheartedly in that mission statement. Or perhaps it's an ideology, for example, Tesla and Elon Musk. Tesla wants to revolutionize the automotive industry. That is a central unifying force worth someone spending their life force trying to achieve. Now you have to think about that within your own company. Just like Charlemagne did with his empire, you have to think about that with your company. Whether or not you're just some solo, designer who, you have a few clients. Why are all those clients looking to you for answers. What is your unifying force within their chaotic elements, their chaotic businesses? Or you're a manager who manages a 100-person team in a massive company. What is your 100-person team? Like, what unites them? Is it a quota for a quarter? Is it a paycheck? I'm not putting anything off limits here. But what I am saying is that there has to be some sort of central focus for a team or a company or an entrepreneurial venture to achieve traction in this world. Just like Charlemagne, no different.
So one thing I think it's important not to forget is that the idea of a unifying force doesn't only bind organizations together and the people and the mission that everyone in an organization participates in toward that end goal, but it's also a unifying force can be a unifier between organizations to drive partnerships. I think it's also important not to overlook the fact that Charlemagne and the Pope and the Catholic Church in general had mutual interests that drove their own unity and allowed them to become a stronger entity together than they were apart. I think that bureaucratic background, the Catholic Church, its ideology was rather separate from Rome itself in terms of what it's about. But the organization and bureaucracy, the tradition are present within how it organized itself, its courts. That's why it was used so frequently at the time as an arbiter, as a judge, as a decider of disputes, because the tradition was respected and it also had logical backings. The Roman court system made sense. And then you also have to talk about the joint message. The church was a unifying factor. So was fear. So the fear of an army. Those forces combined also made sense. So I definitely want to emphasize that he took advantage of every meaning of a united force, both within his own organization and in the partnerships and alliances that he created. He was perfectly able to identify opportunities in common and be able to exploit and create those relationships to the greatest of his benefit. And that is incredibly important and relevant.
There's really only one thing that we kind of have to touch on here to really conclude this section, which is, why did Charlemagne have such a fantastic start to his long career? And that was an obvious display of his ability to execute confidently. When he was called upon to declare war against the Lombards, and he took advantage of that opportunity, he had a united force behind a single banner to achieve that. All eyes looked at him to push the right buttons, delegate the right tasks, move the right pieces on the chessboard. And guess what? He did. He was well read. He was intelligent. He was not arrogant. Now, that was another thing about Charlemagne that I got in my reading, was that Charlemagne was not pompous and he was not arrogant. He found pleasure in some of the simpler things in life. Now, you often read stories about how Charlemagne wore normal clothes. He wasn't always dressed in these extravagant robes. He really did take pleasure in some of the simple aspects of life that allowed him to concentrate more on maybe his reading, his studies, his ability to delegate tasks, his ability to observe the world and how it actually was, not how he was creating it. And that was a key to Charlemagne's ability to execute properly throughout his entire course of his career, was he was not above the world that he was building for himself. That ability, so crucial. And when it was called upon to fight in a battle or send men to their deaths, he was on the front lines. He was the one pushing the buttons and making sure that things got done well. And you can write entire books on that aspect of Charlemagne. But it's very simple, very, clear competency that he possessed. And it's directly correlates to modern business. When you're called upon to, speak at an event, you're called upon to lead a team of people, you're called upon to pitch to a client. You're called upon to think of that next product idea. You're called upon to fix this idea in 3 days. You're called upon to deal with this task that you don't want to have to deal with today because you've got 50 other things that are on top of your head. But when you're called upon to execute, you do so confidently and competently, right? And you don't ever put yourself above the people that you have to lead, right? And that's what makes Elon Musk such a great leader. He's right there with all of his engineers trying to fix the world's problems. And, you don't get that in very many leaders nowadays, vocally or visually, but the ones you do stand out. And Charlemagne was definitely an example of that.
Absolutely. I think you really covered that really well. I think the only things that I would mention is what's also impressive is the guy never lost. I mean, when you almost never lose, you're gonna have a great degree of success and build that up. In some ways, it could be a fluke. In other ways, it seems to me that he had structural advantages that helped him lose. But one thing that he did that was interesting, and it was only partially successful, what can you expect in those times, is he was very grounded, like you said, in understanding advantages that he needed to bequeath, to the next generations. The fact that he had his kids educated and he believed greatly in the importance of education when he had none himself. You see in the modern day, a lot of people tend to just pass on what they themselves have experienced as opposed to trying to observe and make sure that further generations are able to build in structural advantages that will allow them to be even more successful or maintain their prosperity. He is part of confident execution. It isn't just how many wars and battles you win yourself, but also planning for the future, planning in the long term, thinking long term, and trying to create a legacy. And even though his state did last through his kids, but not too much longer than that, in a state that had 100 languages spoken, that's not very likely that would happen. But the tradition of the Holy Roman Empire carried on for almost over 1,000 years. That was, I think, part of his plan. So his ability to execute both during his lifetime and to plan for the next 1,000 years, or plan for a state that would last as long as possible, it's critical for any entrepreneur and any business person, and something incredibly impressive at a time when most of that wasn't known. There was some tradition of that from the Roman era, but he came out of what was essentially nothing at the time, and put that ability to engage in long-term thinking in a short-term world. And that's a really, really important part of any corporate mission, especially one under high stress, like an entrepreneurship or an entrepreneurial organization, as well as a warfare state like his. It's incredibly critical, and he did it.
I'm going to say one thing, Nolan, that is kind of controversial. You ready?
All right.
This is after studying a lot of Roman history, dozens of books, starting to study Charlemagne right now. I've studied a lot of Constantine. I studied a lot of antiquity. When I look at the breadth and the details within the Roman Empire, Charlemagne is the first long-term thinker that I think I've really read about. Maybe Caesar Augustus, but even then, most Romans in the history books are really only focused on their present time.
It's true. The glory of yourself as opposed to the established legacies. It's something I want to look into more about, that kind of discussions of thinking in that way. But the way those Roman emperors lived, and the way the patricians and a lot of them lived, it was definitely about the here and now.
And the reason I would say like Caesar Augustus was not a long-term thinker was because somehow his son got put into a power. And obviously, if anyone's seen the movie Gladiator, you kind of know how that turns out. But Charlemagne was different. I mean, like you said, Nolan, Charlemagne was a millennium thinker.
Yeah, he was creating traditions as opposed to just passing them down and following them. He was making deliberate changes to the lifestyle that his children lived to that of himself. He didn't attribute all of his success simply to the upbringing he had and the traditions he was following. He felt that he innovated, that he made differences that he wasn't taught himself. And so that's why he provided his children with, in those days and even up to today, people frequently feel like you just have to do what I did if I was successful, or what I learned or was taught the way I was taught. And it's a big jump for him to think outside of that and to provide his kids a different upbringing in an attempt to preserve his legacy.
I think that's a really nice tease into the next 6 episodes where we get to talk about all the ups, all the downs. I mean, in ways that Charlemagne, I think in this episode we talked about how Charlemagne was a positive role model, but I think there's a lot of probably the next few episodes where we're going to be talking about how Charlemagne wasn't necessarily the best role model. I mean, he was also a brutal warlord.
Yeah.
He was also ambition at all costs. I mean, it was his ambition, then his family, then everyone else. I mean, it really was.
Absolutely.
So, that obviously comes with some downsides too. So we're going to talk about that also. So it's not just going to be all rah-rah Charlemagne these next 6 episodes. And I'm actually looking more forward to the, hey, this is why Charlemagne sucked.
I mean, that's the fun part, the dark side of human nature.
There always is
it's
something.
Present in all of us.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely present in people with that much power. So there's going to be a lot to dig into there.
It's going to be pretty cool, man. We're really excited to have you, Nolan. Nolan Zandy, everybody.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much, man. These next 6 episodes are going to go by like super fast. Awesome. Well, signing off. Thanks, everybody. This is episode 1 of 7, talking about Charlemagne with the Powerful Entrepreneur podcast. I'm Arthur, your host, and I'll talk to you next time.